Hello everyone, I'm Barb Haake and welcome to Water is Everybody's Business. And I think we know that more in the state of Minnesota than anywhere else in the country, actually. Well, for one thing, did you know we have 10,000 lakes? I've heard 11,000, I've heard 12,000. But of all those lakes we have, 40% are impaired. 60% are lakes that we want to save. In fact, today we're going to be talking about healthy waters. We're going to be talking about saving our lakes and fisheries. And one of the people that I have today to talk and explain many, many different things to you about what we're looking at is Peter Sorensen. And Peter happens to be the professor at the University of Minnesota of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation. I know, very long.
Very long.
He said, just leave it at Peter Sorensen. And he has been at the university since 1988 when you're hired as an assistant professor.
Correct, yeah.
Now you've got yourself as a full professor at the university. Yeah. And we go back a ways. I've had Peter on the program before. But his areas of interest is the biology and control of invasive fishes, behavior of the fish reproductive biology, fish migration, aquatic chemical ecology, marine biology. I can go on and on, I am sure. But as I said, this is the most important thing we have. So now, one view we have of the beautiful, beautiful lakes that we have in Minnesota is this next slide that we're going to have come up here. And it shows, isn't this an ideal setting?
Well, of course, it's just gorgeous. Minnesota's so lucky to have, and we are, to live here, to have so many lakes and rivers. Don't forget the rivers, about 6,000, including the queen of the rivers, the Mississippi River, a very precious resource, one of the greatest rivers in the world, right here.
Oh, and I know, in fact, anyway, I can go into people that come from China that say this river is fabulous. They know what it's like. Yeah. But anyway, many things that we have in our lakes, as I said before, are ones that have been impaired. And what are some of the causes of the problems that we have in our lakes? What are causing some of the issues that we have with impairment in our lakes?
So there are many, and that's, first off, let's say there's really two big problems. One that most people recognize. One is water quality, deteriorating chemistry and clarity of the waters, their ability to enjoy it. And the other, which a lot of people care about, are fisheries, loss of fishable, eatable fish. And these two problems are quite intimately connected. And there are about 6 causes that I'd like to discuss that drive those two problems, which it's part of the theme today is just to address how closely interconnected these are and how we all share the same issues. And the 6 problems really are nutrient runoff, the chemistry of the water, changing climate and the temperature of these waters, shoreline development, the loss of large fish in these waters, a recent arrival of aquatic invasive species, and lastly, dropping water table.
And in all these issues that we have, one of the first ones are the nutrients to me, because I worry about what happens sometimes in the agricultural community with the nutrients that can. Tell me a little bit more about the nutrients.
Well, this is a really important point, and what's also important is that those of us who are fishers, who really care about fishing, should realize this is critical for us to understand too. They're not independent issues at all. The issue with water chemistry is that basically our lakes 1,000 years ago were really clean and pure, and now we've constructed housing along the edges and farming, and nutrients are running into these waters. And the issue really is that I think a lot, it's not just a question of chemicals running in and chemicals running out. The difficulty is that these chemicals bind to sediments in the water, and they bind for decades, so they can't get out. It's almost a quasi-permanent problem. And they get into the waters, and they bind to the sediments, and then they get released, and you get algal growth, and you get green waters that causes the shading, and that causes plant growth, and that changes the fish, and then you go shift into another ecological state that, frankly, science and technologists don't really understand how to get us out of it. And it's an enormous scientific challenge with no easy solutions right now.
Well, we also have climate control, and there's a lot of people that are still denying something like that, although we've had all these hurricanes right now that's going on, and the climate. But at any rate, climate, when it comes
So climate is related to water quality because as the water's warm, and there's no question they are, they're warming with time, the ice is coming off earlier every spring, and as they warm, it has two effects. It actually it causes nutrient release and makes the nutrients available for more algal blooms, which then cause the plants and the fish decline, and it gets into that cycle. And the other issue, that the difficult thing about fish is fish are cold-blooded. They can't regulate their temperatures. So even tiny changes in temperature are immediately felt by them in ways that people don't really appreciate. I'm a fish biologist. This is temperature is a major driver. So climate and temperature are really a great concern for fisheries and water quality. So those are two big things. And it's important to recognize that.
And we also can go into habitat, which is something that we seem to be doing.
Yeah, we are dealing with habitat right now. This has been a problem that people recognized some decades ago. The DNR recognizes as you lose aquatic vegetation around lakes because of sometimes deteriorating water quality or sometimes, frankly, temperature changes, which we can do something about. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But as you lose the habitat, then you lose the places for fish to swim in, and then they no longer eat the plankton that eat the green algae that we don't want. So it's all interrelated. These aren't separate issues at all. And the more I study this, frankly, the older I get, the more I realize it's all part of like the same thing. So the habitat is really key too, Barb.
And this is what causes the loss of fish.
It often does, yeah. With no place to live, you can't have fish. It's pretty simple. So that's a big problem.
Now, one thing that I know our viewers probably have heard so much about are aquatic invasive species, the AIS, as they have. That, to me, is something that we as humans have brought into the situation, haven't we? It came in on ballasts and everything else.
Yeah, by definition, aquatic invasive species are things that we've brought in and have established. And they're almost sort of I don't know, in a sort of a horrible way, they're the icing on the cake. They're a consequence of deteriorating water quality, changing temperature, habitat. Now there's no place for predators to live that might have eaten these things. They get in, they disrupt the food webs, often in subtle ways we don't understand, but it's kind of a death of 1,000 cuts. And things deteriorate and they get worse. And as a biologist, this is something we don't really understand very well. A lot of people realize that. We don't really know how to restore a lake. There's not a single instance that I know of an invasive species actually being extirpated. And frankly, there are very few. This is where we're going with the idea of conservation and preservation. We don't know how really to restore lakes for water quality either. As you said, there's almost 5,000 impaired waters. They're being added to every year. Only a very few have been taken off that list. So the way we're going now it's not very encouraging. And AIS is one of definitely a big issue too. So that's a fourth cause of these two major problems we have.
And the other one is that, in a way, we're all invasive species. We came over
course.
here.
By definition, we're an invasive species.
But what I'm getting at, too, is that we are bringing these boats in. We're bringing things from one lake to another lake. And
absolutely. Everything we've discussed, frankly, if you look at yourself in the mirror, it's us. We've done this, and every single one of these things is avoidable without a great deal of effort. And we'll come to this in a bit, but it's avoidable without a great deal of effort, and frankly, the positive benefits are enormous because, as you're getting the gist here, I hope, everything's interconnected. The problems are extremely complex, extremely expensive, and scientifically difficult to understand, not well understood. It may be decades before we understand it, and things are going down faster than they're going up. And that's the issue with all these causes.
What about the loss of surface waters?
And the loss of surface waters too just exacerbates things. It disrupts balances. One of the issues with these lake systems, which I could talk a little bit about, is they're really it's not a linear relationship. They live in delicate balances that can shift from one thing to another depending on temperature, nutrients, places for fish to hide, fish that eat smaller things, so forth. So as you lose surface waters, that disrupts the balance. And one of the things that's really difficult about this as a biologist is when you shift the balance, it's extremely difficult, almost impossible to get it back. And I think that's something people, it's just good to appreciate that fact that the science is lagging. It's not that we're not trying. It's not that money isn't being spent on it, but it's extremely difficult science to conduct.
So we have, as you just said, all of this is all interconnected, and we
Yes.
also that we are all in this together.
We're all in this together, and then the other piece I just wanted to bring up a little bit on top of it all is this issue of loss of large fishes in lakes. And I think that's it's clear that it's happening. We've had several fisheries collapses, unfortunately, in Minnesota. The causes, I can tell you, are not well understood. They're very complex. It will take a long time to work out. But I think what's important to appreciate, at least a couple facts, is that as the large predators disappear, they have effects down the food web, and you end up with a deteriorating food web with a lot of small things which are undesirable. This can cause a shift in the balance, which, like Mille Lacs, it's very, very difficult to get. It's like a teeter-totter, and once you tip it one way to get it back, it's not just a little bit of effort, it's a lot. You know, you need somebody really heavy on the other side to get back. And then what concerns me as a fisheries biologist is that these fisheries, these fish have evolved for millions of years to have certain sizes and so forth. And for example, female fish that are allowed to grow old, not only do they have more eggs, they have a lot more eggs. It's not a linear relationship, and they're more fecund and they're more viable. So as we remove very large females from the population, which we've been doing since, well, forever really, that causes fundamental changes in the structure of the fishery, which are very hard to recover from. And on top of that, this becomes a phenomenon known as fisheries-induced evolution. And I think basically we have become an evolutionary driving force, like a large predator in the lake. And through generations of this, we are basically driving. There's no question about it. It's not terribly well understood. But we're actually, by removing large fish, for instance, you're favoring those fish that are smaller to stay small and reproduce at smaller sizes and not to be caught in a hook. Because if you are, then you disappear from the gene pool, and that's how evolution works. So we're starting to drive evolutionary processes in lakes that are to our detriment and to the detriment of the balance and health of these systems.
Okay, this is
We're loving them to death.
Inadvertently,
but we are.
But you mentioned also removing the large fish.
Yes.
But it's basically catch and release, and we're putting those back. When we have our fishing, and that's how they have a limit on fish and everything.
Well, often catch and release would help a lot for a lot of fish. And if you look, some of the better fisheries in the state actually are the catch and release fisheries. And this is because our pressures on them have been alleviated. But other fish populations are not being subjected to catch and release. Okay. So we are really, inadvertently through our efforts, are becoming an evolutionary driving force that are causing them to become less healthy.
Okay, and what can we do about this?
Well, I guess what we can do about this, the first thing is to recognize that these problems are severe. They're not very well understood, and that they have to be treated in totality if we're going to be successful. You can't really, or you can witness what's been happening to date. Millions are spent on water quality, for instance, remediation, and with really very little success. We're still going backwards. And this isn't because the state isn't spending a lot of money, or scientists don't care, or government officials don't care. It's just a horrendously difficult problem. We have to view this as an interrelated issue. So we have to realize that water quality is related to the quality of the large sizes of the fish, the presence of invasive species. If you have invasive species, it changes the fisheries. It can change the water quality. It's all part of the same parcel. So we have to recognize that, and we have to recognize, I think we should recognize, the challenge of the problem and the fact that it's not getting better, and that a new approach is needed, at least at the present time, because we're not making much headway. And I think most people recognize that. Whether you're a fisher, or you're concerned about water quality, or just enjoying the aesthetics of lakes, they're being lost. Mm-hmm. So we need, I believe, something new. And what the science tells me, having worked in this field for 30 years, is we need to figure out, and I'll propose this in a second, a way that we can frankly look at preservation as a realistic scenario, an important scenario, before we get all our efforts focused in restoration, which isn't going, the present time very well. We can come back to that, and we should.
Okay, and then one example that you had is in marine biology,
correct.
and we get into areas that are protected in oceans.
Yes. So, water is water. Some water has salt in it, like the oceans, and some water is clear, like the oceans. And really, many of the same basic threats that are facing freshwater today in Minnesota, the loss of large fish, deteriorating water quality, the loss of habitat, these are almost exactly the same in the world's oceans. We're losing coral reefs, we're losing seagrass beds and mangroves, and there it was recognized some time ago, that almost 50 years ago, that the best possible scenario for success to preserve these fisheries for future generations, preserve the water quality, was protection. And it was recognized as a concept known as a marine protected area, Barb. And these areas basically are specialized areas within the oceans where we let nature take care of itself, as it has for millions of years very successfully. And they are so successful that there are now 13,000 to 14,000 of them. They cover several % of the world's oceans. They're still adding to them. And most marine scientists believe this is the best hope for the future until we can figure out how to restore systems. It's just a reality. And I believe that just as this protected area concept has worked in the oceans, it could work in fresh water.
Okay, and that's protecting these ecosystems and the fisheries and everything that's happening in our oceans. Now, other areas that we are protecting, we know already that they have a protected zone or an area for the buffalo.
Right.
And other things
That's
that we have in
entirely
society.
entirely true. So, and I'll come back to the fisheries because that was something I'd like to mention too in marine. But first off, the idea of a marine protected area is just to protect an area or a zone. It's not to necessarily preserve a huge area or exclude anybody. It's just to preserve a key area that's of special importance, let's say to the habitat, protect part to save the whole. And it may only need to be a few % of that area if you pick these areas using good science very carefully, and the rest can still be open for people to enjoy more or less the way they have. And I guess while I'm on it, this is in some cases worked very well for fisheries. I had an example of one that's well known in Florida where they preserved an area of about, I think it's just 15 acres outside of Cape Canaveral, which they primarily saved because they didn't want people getting fried by rocket ships and so forth. But it turned out to be a key area for some of the black drum and red drum, big fisheries there. That area was preserved, just that small section, and within about 10 years, that small area was producing accelerating world record catches of exceptionally large fish, world record captures of fish that far exceeded the 13 or 15% area of shoreline that it represented. In fact, most of the world record captures for black and red drum are now coming from areas just outside of that tiny protected area. All we had to do was let nature take care of itself, to let it serve as its own hatchery, to let the large fish survive for a chance and back off, and it basically forms as a seed for that entire area. And that's a phenomenon known as a spill out. And the fish, they're hatched there, they reproduce there, and they spill out into the surrounding areas, just like a hatchery truck, except nature's doing it for free and doing it better.
Well, how do you actually protect it? Because when you have it, people take their boats out, they go in areas, you can't put a fence around it like you could with cattle or anything like that. How is it that these people stay away from that particular area? How do you
Well, I think what they actually do is they set buoys. They pick these areas out very carefully, and they are usually run by local councils that understand the local habitat very well, working with local fishers and groups and developers, and they decide these areas are just too special to let them run down, the death by 1,000 cuts. And so and then they work with, in the case of the one in Florida, with the Florida Fish and Wildlife that help police it, and everybody works together to everybody's benefit. Everybody sort of sacrifices total, they have access to those areas, but the ability to use it willy-nilly exactly how they want, may be somewhat restricted in those small areas, but they all benefit. And like I said, this phenomenon has taken off across the world, all across the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Oceans.
Coral reefs?
Coral reefs are a particular example, but often they're being used for fisheries like in Australia and in some Pacific islands. They're working very well. They're seen as, Belize is another example. And really, a fish is a fish and water is water. And of course, the oceans aren't exactly the same. We would need special, slightly different nuances of this in fresh water, but the basic principles there should work. And before I forget, I guess the one other thing we wanted to say, this concept, of course, is not just restricted to water, because as we all know, we've been using it on land for over a century. We have wildlife refuges, we have national parks, and we've done this on land because we're very visual. I think the only reason is, frankly, we're very visual animals. We can see it. We can see when the buffalo are disappearing, but it's hard to see when the walleye are disappearing from a lake.
right.
But you can see it when the buffalo go, or some endangered hawk or something disappeared. And we had the common sense to preserve those areas. And bird sanctuaries and wildlife refuges and national parks and
What about Voyageurs National Park?
Voyageurs National Park,
That's the
and
one we
these
all
are
know about.
basically terrestrial protected areas,
Yes.
and we still
And you
use
can
them.
see them.
We all benefit from them, hunters, fishers, recreational. And so this is just, the way I look at it is as a fisheries aquatic biologist, aquatic systems, freshwater is just as sensitive, just as valuable as any of these terrestrial systems or marine systems. The problems are the same. The problem with freshwater, you just can't see it in so well, but it's the same biology, and it should be saved and preserved for exactly the same reasons, and this concept should work for exactly the same reasons.
And because you're talking about the fresh water, we might be leading into the conservative
Yes.
areas, freshwater conservative areas, FCAs.
FCAs, we're proposing then that we create freshwater conservation areas in the state of Minnesota. There wouldn't be a huge number of these. They'd be only very special areas, probably maybe a few percent, maybe a couple hundred lakes in the state of Minnesota might have a certain percentage of the lake saved where that are special value for preserved. The idea is to preserve before it's all gone while there's time for our kids, because as a biologist, I don't know how to bring it back. I do know we can save it. It's pretty clear we can and we should. And so the idea is to preserve or to set aside, restrict not access, but usage in those very special areas, which we'd call freshwater conservation areas. And for exactly the same reason they have in the oceans, and we've set aside national parks and things like that.
And something about 3 different zones that are proposed?
Right. So it's tentative right now. This is a concept we're just developing. It's not a new concept. Like I say, it's been used in the oceans and in land for decades. Freshwater, we have to figure out the most successful, the best way forward for it to succeed that everyone would benefit from. But we want the fishing to be better overall in the lake and so forth. But there might be 3 possible options. Basically, there might be, for instance, just a straight protected area that would be focused on protecting the whole ecosystem. There might be a fisheries zone. I would view these probably, and I will get to in a second how we're going to work this out, but zones within lakes or an area that there might be areas, for instance, for walleye spawning that would be special value to walleye that you just protect just the way they did in Florida for those drum. And I would expect if we did that, we'd get some world record walleye production, which we haven't seen since our grandparents were fishing in these streams. We all knew they were there. They can come back. We have to give nature a chance again. So we'd have fishery zones, and we might have some zones just for basically water quality, special areas that are really important for that reason. So it's a hypothetical scenario, and there might be more of these. Freshwater protected areas, there's 6 types, for instance.
Okay, now going on zones,
Yeah.
and we know that walleyes you mentioned, you've got
Right.
Lake Mille Lacs. So that's a huge lake.
It's huge.
And we'd be able to maybe put up buoys or something along the way and maybe take one area that we know would be terrific and
Right.
keep everybody out from fishing in that particular area of Lake Mille Lacs, perhaps?
Well, they might
how
still,
do you
they
do
would
that?
probably, so we would, well, yeah, we don't want to repeat the tragedy of Mille Lacs, and nobody knows how to bring that system back. It's a perfect example. It suffered from changes in water clarity. It suffered from changing temperatures. It's suffered probably from, frankly, it appears now, maybe too many fish coming out. Invasive species have definitely impacted it, or it seems very clear, spiny water flea, combinations of factors. It's all entangled. It's going to be very, very difficult, unfortunately, to disentangle that and restore it. We don't want that to happen. I don't, not on my watch, anywhere else in the state. So, you know, my druthers would be to look at similar lakes that haven't reached that state of complexity where, you know, by the way, Mille Lacs is what I would call a novel ecosystem. No one's seen anything like that before. This is why scientists struggle with it. It's something no one's seen. We don't know how to deal with it. Let's deal with places we still understand that are still protected and valued and functioning correctly. Identify some areas that perhaps for walleye, maybe in Red Lake or some other, well, there's innumerable lakes where there's invaluable walleye fishing still.
I think this would really resonate with people because they have their lakes, and
course.
they're very precious to the people
Well, they
that
are
are
very-
putting their they are very precious to the people that
Absolutely.
have their cabins and they're recreating on it and everything. They would probably know and be very happy to join something where they say, here's my lake. I don't want to have anything happen to it. How are we going to preserve it? Because I would suggest that Mille Lacs is probably gone at the present time. We've got to do something to preserve what
At the
we've got.
present time, and everyone's scratching their head how to bring it back. Let's
Yeah.
put it that way. And if we're able to do something, it's going to cost a lot of money and take a lot of time. And I sure hope that happens. And I'm not saying to give up on it, but I do know for a fraction of the cost of trying to restore Mille Lacs, we could probably save many, many lakes in the state of Minnesota for the foreseeable future while the science has a chance to catch up. Keep AIS out of those very special areas and let the fisheries and plants take care of themselves. And I think it's important to understand we're not talking about excluding fishers from these areas at all. We're talking about just recognizing that some lakes and situations and zones within lakes are much more valuable than others, and they should be set aside so that they can thrive and do well. So yes, local folks would be heavily involved with this, I would expect, but so there would be a significant input, and there should be from fishers across the state and the DNR. It would have to be a community, it has to be a community effort to work. And no one's restricted from anything. We're all working together to make it better for everybody. That would be the idea. And,
Well, I'm noticing that there is a lady at PCA, because
Yes,
Minnesota
yeah, I saw
PCA
that,
is very
yeah.
important too.
Of course.
We've got the Shannon, and her name is Shannon Lotthammer, and she calls this water ethics, in which we understand that our lakes are important to everybody in Minnesota, and what we do on land affects our water. And how are we managing things like our lawns, agricultural
Absolutely.
practices? We're talking about nutrients that go into the water. We're talking about all the things in keeping soil on the land, preserving wetlands. I mean,
Right.
I already know that the Minnesota River happens to be 90% of all the wetlands have been filled in.
Right.
Which
So it's
causes
time to save what we can.
Yes.
And we've been saving prairies, for instance, and I think most people, if they think about it, will realize we're in a situation with freshwater now, with over 4,000 impaired waters, for instance, and almost 1,000 with AIS, and the numbers increasing on both, that if we don't do something, just like the prairies, we're going to lose it. And it's time to do something analogous to that, to start to preserve those areas by monitoring use in sensible ways and not treating them all the same way, because some sections are more valuable than others.
I would think that there'd be a lot of support from anybody with any common sense on how
I would
this
hope
is-
so. I would hope so. I think what's important, and I think this is one of the things that's impressive. So right now we have a lot of special interests. We have great people working on water quality. We have great people concerned about walleye and restoration. with people concerned in the DNR, in particular about habitat, for instance. But what's not happened is everyone hasn't kind of realized that they're really all trying to solve the same problem. So, for instance, particularly with lakes and freshwater, the surrounding lands are a big part of it. What happens in the surrounding lands, it all runs into the lakes. It accumulates there and it's stuck there. So, land use is also important. We're all in this together, the farmers, the fishers, the people living on the lakes. And if it's going to get fixed, it's got to be working together to solve that using science, and in this case, somewhat new science, science surrounding the preservation and conservation of these areas, not just restoration. We've been focused on restoration, and nothing wrong with that. We should definitely pursue it, but I'm saying I think the money right now is best spent, at least some of it, going towards preservation, so we have something left to work with.
And again,
it's going fast.
And that's sort of what your FCA is thinking of, freshwater conservation areas?
Yeah, so a group of us have formed a foundation, Fish and Waters Conservation Fund, and there's I guess you see it on your screen now, to pursue this. And of course, the idea is to bring the best possible science and pursue some policy options too, to start to address how it might happen, and hopefully build support from various agencies and groups that right now are kind of disconnected, I think, and work with everybody to pull this together. And I'm starting now in the university, not with anybody's particular support. That's why we formed this foundation, because this it's not classical fisheries science, it's not classical water chemistry, for instance. It doesn't really fit anybody's niche. So we've had to create an entity to make it happen. And so we're soliciting support and interest from people, and we're going to start to look at how many of these do we really need to be successful, to save whole entire, how large of an area do you need in a lake to save that entire lake, for instance? Is it 10% or 20%? How much land area do you need? Should it be a special temperature, for instance, to deal with temperature change? Some of these things, so we can target using the best scientific science, because we don't think it's necessary or even appropriate to try and blanket the state with these. It's just picking targets, just the way we have with national parks and state parks and scientific areas. The state of Minnesota is 168 scientific areas, I believe, and not one is exclusively for fresh water. It's amazing. And it's just time to say the water, it's on our license plate. It's just time to say this is important to us here. And let's realize it's sensitive and we're losing it. It's somewhat of a crisis, but we haven't lost it all, not by any means. But we will if we don't act. And this, I think, is one way to move forward with it that's practical. It's been implemented successfully. 13,000 of them across the oceans and going up. Lots of national parks across the globe, and we have state parks, but it's just time, I think, to recognize that it's necessary. It's particularly necessary. It's been necessary for 50 years in Minnesota's lakes, but it's necessary now.
Mm-hmm. And as you said about everybody all getting together, what I have found out in government a lot is that everybody's in silos.
Yes.
And how do they all talk to each other and do and come across this common goal now? This is what we need to have done.
That's what I'm trying to make happen. And scientists, it's human nature. Scientists are the same way. You read, maybe you read about walleye, but you don't read about tuna or something. Right. But a fish is a fish. A drop of water is a drop of water.
And we
all love it. A nutrient's
a
nutrient. We all love it, and it's all connected.
Yes.
And we've got to save ourselves here.
That's right. And I think the key thing here is that the preservation first, restoration later.
First, because we can do that one.
And then we can do that one.
Yeah.
And the other one is that I always like to coin is that water is an amenity. It's not the enemy, and we love our water. Yeah. So I want to thank you very much, Peter,
thank you very much,
coming
Barb.
in. I
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Yeah, thank you.
You're going to reach over.
Yeah, I'll reach over.
Yeah, reach over and say that.
Conversation.
So everybody, thank you very much. And this is our program we love doing is about saving our lakes and our fisheries and healthy waters, and that's so important.
Yep.
So everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
And by the way.